In the days leading up to Christmas in 2014, the centre of Glasgow was filled with the kind of quiet excitement that comes at the end of the year, when people begin to look forward rather than back, and the ordinary routines of daily life take on a sense of anticipation. Streets were crowded with shoppers, the cold air carried conversation and movement, and the glow of festive lights gave the city a warmth that felt reassuring. There was nothing about that moment to suggest that within minutes 6 people would be dead. It was the morning of December 22nd, and refuse lorries were beginning their routine council collection rounds across the city. One such vehicle, operated by Glasgow City Council, had already been working through parts of Glasgow earlier that day, and by mid-afternoon it was making its way through the city centre, following a route that would take it past George Square and down Queen Street, an area that was consistently busy with pedestrians. Inside the cab, Harry Clark was driving, with 2 colleagues seated beside him, as the vehicle moved steadily through traffic and into one of the most crowded parts of the city. There was nothing unusual in its speed or positioning as it approached the junction. To anyone watching, it would have appeared to be just another service vehicle passing through Glasgow, as it had done countless times before. But, as it continued down Queen Street, something changed. Just after 2:30, the lorry moved into one of the busiest stretches of the street at the height of the Christmas rush, and what followed did not unfold gradually or with any clear warning, but all at once. Clark suddenly lost consciousness at the wheel. Without warning, without braking, and without any ability to correct its course, the vehicle veered out of control and mounted the pavement, where pedestrians had been walking only moments before. The lorry struck multiple people as it travelled forward, continuing unchecked until it eventually came to a stop after colliding near the Millennium Hotel. In less than 20 seconds, a familiar city street had been transformed into the scene of a major tragedy. Witnesses would later describe a scene that shifted from ordinary to catastrophic almost instantly, with many saying that at first they struggled to process what they were seeing, as the scale and suddenness of the event made it feel unreal. The street was filled with injured pedestrians, scattered belongings, and the sounds of people calling out both for help and for loved ones. Bags, coats, and shopping items lay where they had been dropped, creating a stark contrast with the festive backdrop that had been there only moments before. Members of the public were the first to respond. Some knelt beside the injured, offering reassurance and trying to keep them conscious, while others used clothing or whatever they had to hand to stem bleeding or provide comfort in the cold. There are accounts of strangers holding hands, speaking softly to people they had never met, and trying to offer some sense of calm in an environment that had become deeply distressing. Emergency services began arriving very quickly, with police, ambulance crews and firefighters moving in to secure the area, treat casualties and establish control over what had rapidly become a major incident. The streets around Queen Street and George Square were cordoned off, and traffic was brought to a halt. The atmosphere in the city centre, so recently filled with the anticipation of Christmas, was replaced by shock, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of grief. 6 people lost their lives that afternoon. They were Jack Sweeney, aged 68, who was remembered by his family as a devoted husband and grandfather, a quiet and kind man whose life centred around those closest to him. Lorraine Sweeney, aged 69, described as a deeply loved matriarch whose presence held her family together. Erin McQuaid, aged 18, an aspiring primary school teacher, said to be full of potential and extremely kind. Stephanie Tate, aged 29, remembered as outgoing, loving and devoted to her family, and whose loss left 2 children without their mum. Gillian Ewing, aged 52, described as hard-working, dependable and caring, whose presence was steady and supportive in the lives of others. And Jacqueline Morton, aged 51, was remembered as a warm and caring woman, devoted to her family and known for her kindness and the way she connected easily with those around her. For the Sweeneys, the loss was particularly devastating, as three members of the same family were taken together in a single moment, turning what should have been a time of celebration into one of unimaginable sorrow. In total, 15 others were injured, some seriously, and many would carry both physical and psychological effects long after the day itself had passed. As investigators began to piece together what had happened, it quickly became clear that this was not an act of intent or recklessness in the conventional sense. Instead, the cause lay in the condition of the driver, who had suffered a blackout at the wheel, later linked to a medical issue known as neurocardiogenic syncope. This is a condition that can cause sudden and unpredictable loss of consciousness. However, the more that was uncovered, the more complex and troubling the situation became. It emerged that Harry Clark had experienced previous episodes of blacking out, including an incident years earlier while driving a bus. These episodes, while not identical in every detail, were significant enough that they should have been disclosed when he applied for his heavy goods vehicle licence, and during medical assessments connected to his employment. The fatal accident inquiry that followed examined these details closely, and while it confirmed that there had been no mechanical fault with the vehicle and no evidence of deliberate wrongdoing, it also concluded that the tragedy might have been avoided if Clark had provided full and accurate information about his medical history. That conclusion, careful and measured in its wording, carried enormous weight, because it suggested that what had happened was not simply unforeseeable, but potentially preventable. In 2015, the decision was made not to pursue criminal charges against Clark, on the basis that he'd been unconscious at the time and therefore lacked the intent required for a criminal conviction. Legally, the reasoning was clear, but for the families of those who had died, it was deeply difficult to accept. Harry Clark himself became a focus of public attention in the months that followed, particularly during the fatal accident inquiry. Acting on legal advice, he declined to answer many of the questions put to him, and when asked directly if he wished to apologise, he said that he could not. While this position was legally justified, given the possibility of further legal action, it was deeply difficult for many of the families to accept. For them, the absence of answers and the absence of an apology at that stage added to a sense of frustration and unresolved grief. Clark would later issue an unreserved apology outside of the inquiry process, expressing sorrow for what had happened, but by that point, for many, the distance and timing of that apology meant it could not fully address the questions that remained. Many expressed a sense that responsibility had fallen into a gap between systems where individual accountability, medical oversight, and institutional safeguards had all, in different ways, failed to prevent what ultimately occurred. Clark's driving licenses were revoked on medical grounds, and he was banned from driving heavy goods vehicles for a period of 10 years. But for those affected, these measures did little to address the scale of the loss. In the absence of criminal charges, many families turned to civil action in search of some form of accountability. Claims were brought against Glasgow City Council as the employer responsible for the vehicle and its operation. In civil law, the focus is not on intent, but on responsibility, and whether the risk could reasonably have been identified and prevented. The council ultimately accepted liability, and compensation was paid to the families of those who were killed and to those who were injured. The settlements amounted to millions of pounds, but for many they did not resolve the deeper question of how such an event had been allowed to happen. The wider impact on Glasgow was profound. The city responded with vigils, tributes, and a visible pause in its usual routines, including the switching off of Christmas lights as a mark of respect. For many residents, the incident changed how they viewed familiar spaces, particularly in the city centre, where the sense of everyday safety had been so suddenly disrupted. What made the tragedy even more difficult for some to process was its proximity to another devastating event in the city's recent history. Just over a year earlier, Glasgow had experienced the Clutha helicopter crash, in which a police helicopter crashed into a crowded pub, killing 10 people and injuring many others. The fact that two such serious and unexpected incidents occurred so close together in time left a lasting impression, reinforcing a sense of collective grief that extended beyond any single event. In the years that followed the bin lorry crash, Attention turned to what, if anything, could be changed to reduce the likelihood of something similar happening again. There was increased emphasis on the importance of medical disclosure for drivers, particularly those operating heavy vehicles, along with renewed scrutiny of how information is shared between individuals, employers, and licensing authorities such as the DVLA. At the same time, the case prompted broader discussions about the limits of systems that rely heavily on self-reporting and whether additional safeguards might be necessary to identify risks that individuals themselves may not fully recognise or disclose. Even with these discussions and incremental changes, the fundamental reality remains that no system can entirely eliminate risk, and that in this case, a combination of human factors and missed opportunities aligned in a way that led to irreversible consequences. The Glasgow bin lorry crash stands as a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can turn into tragedy, and how the causes of such events are often complex, sitting at the intersection of individual actions and wider systems. What happened in Glasgow that day took less than 20 seconds, but for those affected, it did not end there, and it never really will. Quite obviously, this was a terrible tragedy. People lost their lives, and it was also the second tragedy that befell the city in a very short space of time. Our condolences go out to the families of those who lost their lives. Despite everything that happened, I hope you appreciate the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll say goodbye for now.